10 minutes' talk with the keepers of it, and thought them rather good men." "Good men do commit crimes sometimes," said Basil, taking the ticket out of his mouth, "but this kind of good man doesn't commit that kind of crime. Well, shall we get on this omnibus?" The great green vehicle was indeed plunging and lumbering along the dim wide street towards us. Basil had stepped from the curb, and for an instant it was touch and go whether we should all have leapt on it and been borne away to the restaurant and the theatre. "Basil," I said, taking him firmly by the shoulder, "I simply won't leave this street and this house." "Nor will I," said Rupert, glaring at it and biting his fingers. "There's some black work going on there. If I left it, I should never sleep again." Basil looked at us both seriously. "Of course, if you feel like that," he said, "we'll investigate further. You'll find it's all right, though. They're only two young Oxford fellows. Extremely nice, too, though rather infected with this pseudo-Darwinian business. Ethics of evolution and all that. I think," said Rupert darkly, ringing the bell, "that we shall enlighten you further about your ethics." "And may I ask," said Basil gloomily, "what it is that you propose to do?" "I propose, first of all," said Rupert, "to get into this house. Secondly, to have a look at these nice young Oxford men. Thirdly, to knock them down, bind them, gag them, and search the house." Basil stared indignantly for a few minutes. Then he was shaken for an instant with one of his sudden laughs. "Poor little boys," he said, "but it almost serves them right for holding such silly views after all." And he quaked again with amusement. "There's something confoundedly Darwinian about it." "I suppose you mean to help us," said Rupert. "Oh yes, I'll be in it," answered Basil, "if it's only to prevent your doing the poor chaps any harm." He was standing in the rear of our little procession, looking indifferent and sometimes even sulky, but somehow the instant the door opened he stepped first into the hall, glowing with urbanity. "So sorry to haunt you like this," he said. "I met two friends outside who very much want to know you. May I bring them in?" "Delighted, of course," said a young voice, the unmistakable voice of the Isis. And I realized that the door had been opened, not by the decorous little servant girl, but by one of our hosts in person. He was a short but shapely young gentleman, with curly dark hair and a square, snub-nosed face. He wore slippers and a sort of blazer of some incredible college purple. "This way," he said. "Mind the steps by the staircase. This house is more crooked and old-fashioned than you would think from its snobbish exterior. There are quite a lot of odd corners in the place, really." "That," said Rupert with a savage smile, "I can quite believe." We were by this time in the study, or back parlour, used by the young inhabitants as a sitting-room, an apartment littered with magazines and books ranging from Dante to detective stories. The other youth, who stood with his back to the fire smoking a corn-cob, was big and burly, with dead brown hair brushed forward and a Norfolk jacket. He was that particular type of man whose every feature and action is heavy and clumsy, and yet who is, you would say, rather exceptionally a gentleman. "Any more arguments?" he said, when introductions had been effected. "I must say, Mr. Grant, you are rather severe upon eminent men of science such as we. I've half a mind to chuck my DSc and turn minor poet." "Bosh," answered Grant. "I never said a word against eminent men of science. What I complain of is a vague popular philosophy which supposes itself to be scientific when it is really nothing but a sort of new religion, and an uncommonly nasty one. When people talked about the fall of man, they knew they were talking about a mystery, a thing they didn't understand. Now that they talk about the survival of the fittest, they think they do understand it, whereas they have not merely no notion, they have an elaborately false notion of what the words mean. The Darwinian movement has made no difference to mankind, except that, instead of talking unphilosophically about philosophy, they now talk unscientifically about science." "That is all very well," said the big young man, whose name appeared to be Burrows. "Of course, in a sense, science, like mathematics or the violin, can only be perfectly understood by specialists. Still, the rudiments may be of public use. Greenwood here," indicating the little man in the blazer, doesn't know one note of music from another. Still, he knows something. He knows enough to take off his hat when they play God Save the King. He doesn't take it off by mistake when they play Oh Dem Golden Slippers. Just in the same way, science—" Here Mr. Burrows stopped abruptly. He was interrupted by an argument uncommon in philosophical controversy, and perhaps not wholly legitimate. Rupert Grant had bounded on him from behind, flung an arm around his throat, and bent the giant backwards. "Knock the other fellow down, Swinburne," he called out, and before I knew where I was locked in a grapple with the man in the purple blazer. He was a wiry fighter who bent and sprang like a whalebone, but I was heavier and had taken him utterly by surprise. I twitched one of his feet from under him. He swung for a moment on the single foot, and then we fell with a crash amid the litter of newspapers, myself on top. My attention for a moment released by victory, I could hear Basil's voice finishing some long sentence of which I had not heard the beginning. Wholly, I must confess, unintelligible to me, my dear sir, and I need not say unpleasant. Still, one must side with one's old friends against the most fascinating new ones. Permit me, therefore, in tying you up in this antimacassar, to make it as commodious as handcuffs can reasonably be, while—" I had staggered to my feet. The gigantic Burrows was toiling in the garrote of Rupert, while Basil was striving to master his mighty hands. Rupert and Basil were both particularly strong, but so was Mr. Burrows. How strong we knew a second afterwards. His head was held back by Rupert's arm, but a convulsive heave went over his whole frame. An instant after, his head plunged forward like a bull's, and Rupert Grant was slung head over heels, a Catherine wheel of legs, on the floor in front of him. Simultaneously, the bull's head butted Basil in the chest, bringing him also to the ground with a crash, and the monster, with a berserker roar, leaped at me and knocked me into the corner of the room, smashing the waste-paper basket. The bewildered Greenwood sprang furiously to his feet. Basil did the same, but they had the best of it now. Greenwood dashed to the bell and pulled it violently, sending peals through the great house. Before I could get panting to my feet, and before Rupert, who had been literally stunned for a few moments, could even lift his head from the floor, 2 footmen were in the room. Defeated even when we were in a majority, we were now outnumbered. Greenwood and one of the footmen flung themselves upon me, crushing me back into the corner upon the wreck of the paper basket. The other 2 flew at Basil and pinned him against the wall. Rupert lifted himself on his elbow, but he was still dazed. In the strained silence of our helplessness, I heard the voice of Basil come with a loud, incongruous cheerfulness. "Now this," he said, "is what I call enjoying oneself." I caught a glimpse of his face, flushed and forced against the bookcase, from between the swaying limbs of my captors and his. To my astonishment, his eyes were really brilliant with pleasure, like those of a child heated by a favourite game. I made several apoplectic efforts to rise, but the servant was on top of me so heavily that Greenwood could afford to leave me to him. He turned quickly to come to reinforce the 2 who were mastering Basil. The latter's head was already sinking lower and lower, like a leaking ship, as his enemies pressed him down. He flung up one hand, just as I thought him falling, and hung on to a huge tome in the bookcase, a volume, I afterwards discovered, of St. Chrysostom's Theology. Just as Greenwood bounded from the room towards the group, Basil plucked the ponderous tome bodily out of the shelf, swung it, and sent it spinning through the air, so that it struck Greenwood flat in the face and knocked him over like a rolling ninepin. At the same instant, Basil's stiffness broke, and he sank, his enemies closing over him. Rupert's head was clear, but his body shaken. He was hanging as best he could on to the half-prostrate Greenwood. They were rolling over each other on the floor, both somewhat enfeebled by their falls, but Rupert certainly the more so. I was still successfully held down. The floor was a sea of torn and trampled papers and magazines, like an immense waste-paper basket. Burrows and his companion were almost up to the knees in them, as in a drift of dead leaves, and Greenwood had his legs stuck right through a sheet of the Pall Mall Gazette, which clung to it ludicrously like some fantastic trouser frill. Basil, shot from me in a human